My granddaughter was only 9 years old when she accidentally uncovered a secret that would destroy 2 marriages, expose a years-long conspiracy, and save everything I had spent my entire life building. At the time, neither of us knew any of that. To her, it was just another quiet evening on Grandpa's farm. To me, it was the last peaceful day I would ever have. My name is Otis Penhallow. I am 68 years old, and I have spent more than 4 decades working the same Pennsylvania farmland my father left behind. I thought I had already survived the hardest chapter of my life when I buried my first wife after her battle with cancer. I thought the storms were behind me. I was wrong. The evening it all began, the sun was setting over the pasture, painting everything gold. The cows were settling down for the night, and a cool breeze drifted across the fields. My granddaughter Marisol sat beside me on the back porch swing, happily peeling a clementine. She always tried to remove the peel in one long spiral because it was a trick I taught her years ago. She was concentrating so hard on her little challenge that I barely paid attention when she started talking. Then she casually said something that made my blood run cold. "Grandpa, Aunt Lainey was kissing Mr. Drew in the barn yesterday." At first, I thought I had misunderstood her. I turned slowly and looked at her. "What did you say, sweetheart?" She shrugged without looking up. "Aunt Lainey was kissing Mr. Drew in the barn. They didn't see me." She said it as casually as if she were telling me she had seen a rabbit near the fence. No excitement, no confusion, no drama, just a simple statement of fact. My stomach tightened instantly. Drew was my son-in-law. Lainey was my wife's younger sister. There was absolutely no innocent reason for the two of them to be alone in my barn. For several seconds I couldn't speak. I simply watched the sunset while a strange heaviness settled into my chest. Part of me wanted to dismiss it immediately. Children misunderstand things all the time. Maybe she had seen a hug. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe there was some explanation that made sense. But deep down, something felt wrong. Very wrong. Finally I asked, "Are you sure it was Drew?" She nodded immediately. "Yep, I saw them. They were kissing." Then she broke off another piece of her clementine and smiled at me. "Do you want half, Grandpa?" I forced myself to smile back and accepted the fruit. But inside, a storm had already begun. As darkness slowly covered the farm, I couldn't shake the feeling that my granddaughter had just handed me the first piece of a puzzle that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. What I didn't know yet was that the truth waiting behind that puzzle was far worse than simple betrayal. It was a calculated plan years in the making, and every person I trusted was standing much closer to it than I could possibly imagine. That night, after my granddaughter ran back into the house, I remained alone on the porch long after the sun disappeared. The fields were dark. The crickets had started singing. Normally, evenings like that brought me peace. For more than 40 years, this farm had been the one place where I could clear my mind. But not that night. That night, I sat there replaying Marisol's words over and over again. Aunt Lainey was kissing Mr. Drew in the barn yesterday. Every time I heard those words in my head, they felt heavier. I wanted to dismiss them. God knows I wanted to. Drew had been married to my daughter Rhoda for 11 years. He was the father of my grandchildren. He called me sir. He shook my hand every Sunday. I had trusted him. As for Lainey, she was my wife Corinne's younger sister. She had been coming to our house almost every week since moving closer to us. The idea that the two of them could be involved felt ridiculous. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more certain details began floating back into my memory. Small things, strange things, things I had ignored at the time. A glance that lasted a little too long. A private joke that seemed oddly personal. Moments that had felt harmless months ago suddenly looked different. Around midnight, I was still awake in bed beside Corinne. She was sleeping peacefully while I stared at the ceiling. I listened to the sound of her breathing and wondered how much she knew. Then I hated myself for even thinking that. Corinne had been good to me since the day we met. After losing my first wife, I never expected to fall in love again. Meeting Corinne at that county fair had felt like a second chance at happiness. The idea that any part of my marriage could be connected to what Marisol had seen was something I wasn't ready to consider. But I was old enough to know one important lesson. Never accuse someone without proof. Years earlier, a business partner had stolen $12,000 from me because I trusted my emotions more than evidence. I promised myself I would never make that mistake again. So instead of confronting anyone, I made a decision. I would investigate quietly. The next morning, I climbed into my truck and drove to the far end of the property where nobody could overhear me. Then I picked up my phone and called my daughter. The moment she answered, I knew something was wrong. Her voice sounded tired, careful, almost nervous. I took a deep breath and asked the question that had been keeping me awake all night. Rhoda, I need you to be honest with me. How are things between you and Drew? Silence filled the line. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The silence lasted so long that I felt my stomach tighten again. Finally, she spoke. Dad, why are you asking me that? The way she said it sent a chill through my entire body. Because in that moment, before she even answered, I realized something terrifying. My daughter wasn't surprised by the question. She was afraid of it. And that meant she already knew something I didn't. For a few seconds after I asked the question, neither of us spoke. I sat inside my truck staring through the windshield at the lower pasture, while my daughter's silence echoed through the phone. Parents know their children. It doesn't matter if those children are 10 years old or 41. Sometimes a single pause tells you more than 1,000 words ever could. And in that moment, I knew. I knew my daughter wasn't shocked by my question. I knew she had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Finally, Rhoda exhaled slowly. Dad, where are you right now? I looked out across the farm and said, down by the south field. Another pause followed. Then she said something that immediately confirmed my worst fear. Don't talk about this over the phone. I'll drive up there. 2.5 hours later, Rhoda pulled into the farm. She came alone. No Drew, no kids, no explanations. Just a determined expression on her face that reminded me of her mother. We didn't go inside the house. We didn't sit at the kitchen table. Instead, we parked beside the equipment shed where nobody could overhear us. The moment she climbed into my truck, I turned toward her and asked the question directly. How long have you known? Rhoda lowered her eyes and stared at her hands. When she finally answered, her voice barely rose above a whisper. 9 months. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. 9 months. My daughter had been carrying this burden for nearly a year. 9 months? I repeated. She nodded. Then she started telling me everything. It had begun with small changes in Drew's behavior. His phone was suddenly always face down. He started taking long showers after work. Sometimes he would claim he was working late, but his mileage didn't match his commute. Most people would have ignored those details. My daughter wasn't most people. Rhoda was a litigator. She built cases for a living. She paid attention to details, because details won battles. At first, she thought she was imagining things. She wanted to believe her husband was simply stressed. But the strange behavior continued, week after week, month after month. Then, one evening, she noticed something that changed everything. Drew accidentally left an email account open on an old device. Most wives would have closed it. Most wives would have respected his privacy. Rhoda didn't. By that point, her instincts were screaming at her. What she found inside that account shattered her world. There were emails, hundreds of them, messages hidden from everyone, conversations stretching back months. At first, she thought she was looking at evidence of an affair. That alone would have been devastating enough. But as she kept reading, she realized something much worse was happening. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just two people sneaking around behind their spouses' backs. Drew and Lainey were working together on something deliberate, something planned, something that involved far more than broken vows. I stared at my daughter in disbelief. What are you saying? Rhoda looked me directly in the eyes. The anger she had been carrying for months was suddenly visible on her face. Then she spoke the words that changed everything. Dad, They aren't just cheating. They are building something together. And I think you're the target." The moment Rhoda said I was the target, I felt a chill run through my entire body. For several seconds, I simply stared at her. I had expected to hear about betrayal. I had expected to hear about lies. I had even prepared myself to hear details about an affair. But I had not prepared myself to hear that someone might have been using my family as part of a larger plan. "Target for what?" I asked. Rhoda took a deep breath before answering. "Dad, before I tell you the rest, you need to understand something. This didn't start last year. It didn't even start when Lainey moved here. I think this started years ago." Those words hit me harder than anything else she had said. Years ago. Suddenly, every memory I had of meeting Corinne began replaying inside my head. The county fair, the preserve stand, the phone calls, the dates, the wedding. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether any of it had happened by chance. Rhoda opened a folder she had brought with her. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, bank records, and notes she had spent months collecting. She handed me several pages. The first email was dated almost 3 years earlier. The second was even older. As I scanned the pages, my stomach tightened. Lainey and Drew had been communicating long before anyone suspected anything. Their conversations weren't romantic at first. They were strategic. They discussed property values. They discussed zoning regulations. They discussed development opportunities. Most disturbing of all, they discussed my farm. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. "Dad," Rhoda said quietly, "they weren't interested in you. They were interested in what you owned." I felt my jaw tighten. My farm wasn't just land. It was my life. 460 acres built through decades of sacrifice. Land my father had worked. Land my grandfather had dreamed about owning. Land that carried every important memory of my family. Rhoda continued explaining what she had discovered. Years earlier, developers had approached me several times about purchasing part of the property. I had rejected every offer. The back 90 acres alone were worth millions because of their location and development potential. Apparently, someone else had noticed that value too. According to the emails, Lainey had spent years researching the property. She knew exactly which sections were most valuable. She knew which parcels could generate the largest profits. She even knew details that very few people outside the family should have known. Then came the most shocking discovery of all. Lainey's name appeared in conversations about my marriage to Corinne. Not casual conversations. Planning conversations. Rhoda pointed toward one particular email and said, "This is the one that scared me." I read it twice before the meaning fully registered. Lainey wasn't discussing me as a person. She wasn't discussing my happiness. She wasn't discussing my future with her sister. She was discussing me like an investment opportunity, a project, a financial asset. The realization made me feel physically sick. Suddenly the affair between Drew and Lainey seemed almost secondary. The cheating was terrible, but it wasn't the real story. The real story was much darker. Someone had spent years positioning themselves around my family. Someone had been patient. Someone had been waiting. Then Rhoda looked directly at me and delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Dad, I think Lainey deliberately brought Corinne into your life because she knew exactly what this farm would be worth one day." I wish I could tell you that I immediately rejected what Rhoda was saying. I wish I could tell you that I stood up for my wife and insisted there had to be some misunderstanding. The truth is much uglier than that. By the time we reached that point in the conversation, too many pieces were already fitting together. Too many questions suddenly had answers. I sat quietly inside the truck while Rhoda continued organizing the documents spread across her lap. Every page seemed to reveal another layer of deception. Every page made me feel a little older, a little more foolish. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me ever since she mentioned the land. What exactly were they planning to do? Rhoda looked at me carefully before answering. I could tell she hated what she was about to say. "Dad, they weren't planning to steal the farm today. They were planning to steal it eventually." I felt my stomach drop. She pointed toward several emails and financial records. Then she began laying out the entire scheme, piece by piece. Years earlier, developers had offered millions of dollars for the back 90 acres of my property. The land contained valuable timber and sat in an area that could eventually support luxury housing developments. I had refused every offer because I never wanted to see that land destroyed. But Lainey saw those refusals differently. To her, every rejected offer represented money waiting to be claimed. According to the emails, she had spent years studying property values, inheritance laws, and development opportunities. She knew exactly how much the farm could be worth if certain parcels were sold. More importantly, she knew she couldn't access any of it directly. That's where Corinne came in. My chest tightened as Rhoda pulled out a copy of my prenuptial agreement. I remembered signing it before the wedding. At the time, I thought it was simply a formality, a way to protect both families and avoid future conflicts. My daughter had reviewed it. I had reviewed it. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But buried deep inside the agreement was a clause neither of us had fully understood. Rhoda handed me a highlighted page. "Read this section." I read it once, then again. The legal language made my head hurt, but eventually the meaning became clear. If I ever entered a commercial development agreement involving part of my property during my marriage, a significant portion of those future proceeds could become subject to claims by my surviving spouse. In simple English, if the land became valuable enough and I died before the legal issues were resolved, Corinne could gain access to an enormous amount of money, regardless of what my will said. My hands began shaking. "You're telling me this was put there intentionally?" Rhoda nodded. "The lawyer who drafted it had connections to Lainey." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Rhoda revealed the final piece. The emails showed that Drew wasn't simply having an affair. He was actively helping Lainey evaluate the property. As an engineer, he understood development projects, infrastructure requirements, water access, and zoning possibilities. He was providing technical expertise, while Lainey coordinated the long-term strategy. Together, they discussed future development scenarios, projected profits, and even possible ownership structures. They weren't behaving like reckless lovers. They were behaving like business partners. That's when the full horror finally hit me. The affair wasn't the center of the story. It was merely a side effect of something much larger. This wasn't a spontaneous betrayal. This wasn't a mistake. This was a carefully constructed operation that had been unfolding for years. Every conversation, every introduction, every legal document, every relationship, all of it appeared connected to one goal. The farm. My farm. The land my father bought in Mngin Chin Trum Sao Mihai. The land I had spent 43 years protecting. I looked out across the fields through the truck window and felt tears forming in my eyes. Not because of the money, not because of the property, but because for the first time I realized something devastating. The people behind this scheme hadn't simply targeted my assets. They had targeted my trust. And somehow, they had gotten closer than I ever imagined possible. I have been through some difficult seasons in my life. I survived the dairy crisis that nearly destroyed family farms across Pennsylvania. I rebuilt a barn after a fire turned years of work into ashes overnight. I buried my first wife after watching cancer slowly take her away from me. I thought I understood heartbreak. I thought I understood betrayal. Sitting inside that truck with my daughter, I realized I had never experienced anything like this. For the first time in many years, I felt completely exhausted. Not physically exhausted, spiritually exhausted. I looked down at my hands resting on the steering wheel. These hands had built fences, repaired machinery, delivered calves, planted crops, and carried my wife's coffin into a church. Yet somehow, they had failed to recognize the people standing closest to me. "How long?" I finally asked. "How long have they been planning this?" Rhoda lowered her eyes before answering. "Based on everything I've found, at least 3 years, maybe longer." 3 years, the number echoed inside my head. 3 years of conversations, 3 years of planning, 3 years of smiling at family dinners while secretly calculating how to profit from my death. I felt something inside me break. My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. I turned away because I didn't want my daughter to see. But she saw anyway. Rhoda reached across the seat and grabbed my hand. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. We simply sat there together while the weight of the truth settled over us. Finally, I shook my head and said, "I was a fool." Rhoda immediately squeezed my hand tighter. "No, Dad. I married her. I brought her into this family. I trusted all of them." "You trusted people you loved," she replied. "That's not being a fool. That's being human." I wanted to believe her, but at that moment, I wasn't sure I could. Every memory suddenly felt contaminated. Every happy moment now carried a question mark. Had Corinne really loved me? Had she ever loved me? Or had I simply been another step in someone else's plan? Rhoda seemed to sense where my thoughts were going. "Dad, listen to me carefully. We don't know everything yet. We know enough." "No," she said firmly. "We know they were planning something. We know Drew and Lainey were involved. But if we make a move right now, they'll destroy evidence, change their stories, and disappear behind lawyers before we can stop them." I looked at her. "Then what do we do?" For the first time since arriving at the farm, a different expression appeared on her face. The sadness was still there. The anger was still there. But now I saw something else. Determination. The same determination that had made her one of the most respected litigators in her firm. "We do nothing," she said. I stared at her in disbelief. "Nothing?" She nodded. "For 6 weeks, everything stays exactly the same. You smile. You eat dinner with them. You act like you know absolutely nothing." The idea sounded impossible. Every instinct in my body wanted to confront them immediately. Every instinct wanted answers. But then Rhoda leaned forward and delivered the sentence that changed the entire direction of the battle. "Dad, we're not trying to catch them lying anymore. We're going to let them bury themselves." Suddenly, I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the counterattack. The hardest part of the entire ordeal wasn't discovering the betrayal. It wasn't reading the emails. It wasn't learning that people I trusted had been planning behind my back for years. The hardest part was pretending I knew nothing while sitting across the table from them every single week. For 6 long weeks, I lived inside a performance. Every morning I woke up knowing exactly who they were, and every evening I had to smile as if nothing had changed. Rhoda's plan depended on patience. She kept reminding me that emotions win arguments, but evidence wins wars. So I followed her instructions. I went home that evening and kissed Corinne goodnight, exactly as I always had. I sat beside her in church on Sunday. I listened to her talk about gardening, grocery shopping, and holiday plans. All the while, a question kept echoing in my mind. How much did she actually know? Was she another victim being manipulated by her sister, or had she willingly participated in everything? I didn't have the answer yet. Meanwhile, Lainey continued showing up at the farm almost every weekend. She walked through my front door carrying bottles of wine and acting like family. She laughed at my table. She asked about the cows. She complimented meals. Watching her became almost unbearable. Every smile looked fake. Every joke sounded rehearsed. Yet somehow, she never suspected a thing. Drew was even worse. Every Sunday he shook my hand and called me sir. Every Sunday he sat beside my daughter, pretending to be a devoted husband and father. The man had been sleeping with his wife's aunt while secretly discussing ways to profit from my property, yet he still had the nerve to smile across the dinner table. More than once, I nearly lost control. More than once, I wanted to throw him off my land with my own hands, but Rhoda kept reminding me that the trap wasn't ready yet. Then came the next phase of the plan. My granddaughter Marisol finally told her mother what she had seen in the barn. Just as before, she said it innocently. She wasn't trying to expose anyone. She was simply telling the truth. Rhoda reacted exactly as we had discussed. She acted shocked, hurt, confused. She cried real tears, because despite everything she already knew, Hearing the confirmation from her daughter still broke her heart. When Drew came home that evening, she confronted him. Not about the emails, not about the land, not about the conspiracy, only about the affair. Drew immediately did what selfish people always do when they think they've been partially caught. He tried to minimize the damage. He admitted enough to sound honest, while hiding the worst parts. He claimed the relationship had only been going on for a few months. That was a lie. He claimed it was over. That was another lie. He claimed he was sorry. Nobody believed that one. Then something happened exactly as Rhoda predicted. Drew panicked. He believed his secret had been exposed. He believed the smartest move was to get ahead of the situation before more information surfaced. Within days, he hired a lawyer and filed for divorce. The moment Rhoda received the paperwork, she called me. I could hear satisfaction in her voice for the first time in months. "Dad," she said. He took the bait. That single sentence told me everything. Drew thought he was escaping a cheating scandal. He had no idea he was walking directly into a legal disaster that would destroy everything he had spent years building. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than anger. I felt hope, because the people who believed they were the hunters were about to discover they had become the prey. The moment Drew filed for divorce, the entire game changed. For months, Rhoda had been quietly gathering evidence while everyone else believed they were controlling the situation. Now, for the first time, she could finally begin revealing what she had discovered. The difference was simple. Drew thought he was ending a marriage. In reality, he was triggering the collapse of a conspiracy. Less than 24 hours after receiving the divorce petition, Rhoda's legal team filed a response. But it wasn't a normal response. It wasn't a fight over custody. It wasn't a fight over money. It was a carefully prepared legal strike designed to expose years of deception all at once. I remember sitting in her office while she showed me the stack of documents waiting to be filed. The pile looked thick enough to stop a bullet. Every page represented another lie, another hidden transaction, another piece of evidence linking Drew and Lainey to a much larger scheme. Rhoda opened the first folder. Inside were copies of emails stretching back years. Messages that proved the affair had lasted far longer than Drew admitted. Messages discussing private family matters. Messages discussing my property. Messages discussing future plans that had absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with money. Then she opened the second folder, financial records, bank transfers, electronic payments, hidden transactions moving between accounts connected to Drew and Lainey. Individually, the payments looked harmless. Together, they painted a very different picture. They showed cooperation, coordination, planning. The third folder contained something even more damaging. Audio recordings. When Rhoda first mentioned them, I didn't ask where they came from. I didn't want to know. What mattered was what they contained. In one recording, Drew and Lainey discussed future development opportunities involving my land. In another, they talked about legal strategies. In another, they joked about how little certain family members understood what was happening around them. Listening to those recordings made my blood boil. For years, they had treated my family like pieces on a chessboard. They believed they were smarter than everyone else. They believed nobody could see what they were building behind the scenes. They were wrong. But the most devastating evidence wasn't the affair. It wasn't the recordings. It wasn't even the money. The most devastating evidence was the prenuptial agreement. Rhoda hired 2 independent attorneys to review every clause. Both reached the same conclusion. The language buried inside that contract created a potential pathway for enormous financial gain if certain future events occurred. More importantly, the emails suggested those provisions were not accidental. They were intentional, planned, designed. By the time all the evidence was organized, the story became impossible to ignore. This wasn't merely infidelity. This wasn't merely family drama. This was a coordinated effort involving deception, hidden relationships, financial planning, and long-term manipulation. Rhoda looked at me across her desk and said something I will never forget. "Dad, They're still confident because they think we only know about the affair." She smiled slightly before sliding another folder across the table. "They have no idea we've uncovered everything else." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the balance of power shifting. Drew and Lainey still believed they were controlling the board. They still believed they were several moves ahead. What they didn't realize was that every piece of evidence they thought was hidden had already been collected, organized, and prepared for court. And the final move was coming. In just a few days, they would walk into a family dinner, expecting to celebrate their future. Instead, they would come face to face with the complete destruction of everything they had spent years trying to build. For 6 weeks, we waited. 6 weeks of smiles, lies, fake conversations, and carefully controlled emotions. 6 weeks of watching people sit at my table and eat my food, while secretly believing they were getting closer to owning everything I had spent my life building. Then finally, the day arrived. The day Rhoda and I had been preparing for. The day the masks would come off. A few days earlier, I had casually mentioned to Corinne that I was reconsidering one of the old development offers on the back 90 acres. I made sure to sound uncertain, curious, open-minded, just enough to start a conversation. Exactly as Rhoda predicted, the information traveled quickly. Corinne told Lainey. Lainey told Drew. And before long, everyone involved in the scheme believed their years of patience were finally about to pay off. By the time family dinner arrived that Sunday evening, I could practically feel their excitement. Corinne spent the entire day preparing one of my favorite meals. Lainey arrived wearing a smile she couldn't quite hide. Even Drew looked unusually relaxed. They thought they were witnessing the beginning of their victory. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. The dining room looked warm and welcoming that night. The table was beautifully set. The smell of homemade soup filled the house. To anyone looking from the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary family gathering. But underneath that peaceful surface, a storm was waiting. I let everyone eat. I listened to the conversation. I smiled when necessary. I even laughed once or twice. The performance had become second nature by then. Halfway through dinner, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. Corinne stood up. "I'll get it," she said. A minute later, she returned, carrying a large envelope. She looked confused. "Some man says I need to sign for this." My heart remained perfectly calm. I had been waiting for this moment for over a month. "Go ahead and open it," I said. Corinne sat down and pulled out the documents. At first she frowned. Then she began reading more carefully. The color slowly drained from her face. Across the table, Lainey noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. Corinne didn't answer. She kept reading. Her hands started trembling. Finally, I broke the silence. "It's a lawsuit." The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked directly at Lainey. "Actually, it's several lawsuits." For the first time since I had known her, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. She glanced toward Drew, who suddenly looked like a man struggling to breathe. Rhoda sat quietly at the end of the table, watching everything unfold exactly as planned. Then I began speaking, not loudly, not angrily, calmly. Every word felt heavier than the last. I told them about the emails. I told them about the recordings. I told them about the financial transfers. I told them about the evidence connecting them to the scheme against my property. With every sentence, their expressions grew worse. The confidence disappeared first, then the arrogance, then the hope. Finally, only panic remained. Lainey suddenly stood up and shouted, "You can't prove any of this." That was the moment Rhoda slid a thick folder across the table. "Actually," she said quietly, "we can." The room went silent again. Complete silence. The kind of silence that comes when people realize the game is over. I looked at Corinne one final time. Then I delivered the words I had rehearsed in my head for 6 long weeks. "Your bags are packed. They're waiting in the front hall. By tomorrow morning, you and your sister will be gone from my life forever." And in that moment, the empire they had spent years building collapsed completely. The months that followed felt strangely peaceful. After so much deception, anger, and uncertainty, silence returned to the farm. The kind of silence I used to take for granted. The lawsuits moved forward exactly as Rhoda predicted. The evidence was overwhelming. The prenuptial agreement was ultimately rescinded after the court determined that critical information had been concealed during its creation. Drew quickly discovered that years of manipulation come with a very expensive price tag. The divorce settlement left him with almost nothing. He lost the house, much of his savings, and most importantly, the trust of the children who had once adored him. Lainey faced consequences of her own. The woman who believed she was the smartest person in every room learned that arrogance often blinds people to the dangers directly in front of them. As for Corinne, I never saw her again after the night she left. Part of me still believes she didn't understand the full extent of her sister's plan until it was too late. But some mistakes carry consequences, regardless of intention. My responsibility was no longer protecting her. It was protecting my family. Today, my granddaughter is 11 years old. She still sits beside me on the porch peeling clementines in one long spiral. My daughter still comes to Sunday dinner. Sometimes we talk about what happened. Most of the time, we don't. We simply enjoy being together. Last summer, I sold the back 90 acres to a state conservation trust instead of a developer. The land will remain protected forever, and a small plaque bearing my first wife's name now stands beside the creek she loved. Looking back, I learned something important. Betrayal may hide in the shadows for years, but truth only needs one brave person willing to speak it aloud. In my case, that person was a little girl who trusted her grandfather enough to tell him what she saw. And because she did, everything worth saving was saved.